Welcome to this explainer. History classes often paint pre-1857 India as this quiet, passive landscape. It's almost described as a sleeping giant, just patiently waiting for a massive revolution to finally wake it up. Well, today we are completely shattering that myth. We're diving into what was really a boiling cauldron of fierce, continuous resistance that drastically predated the famous events of 1857. We're going to unpack exactly who was rebelling, why they were so fiercely angry, and why their incredible, desperate efforts ultimately didn't topple an empire. Okay, let's look at exactly how we're going to break this down. We'll be covering discontent before the rebellion, peasant and religious uprisings, the tribal revolts, mutiny in the ranks, and finally, we'll wrap up with an analysis of why the uprisings failed.
Let's jump right into part one, discontent before the rebellion. We're looking at decades of continuous resistance.
At this time, British expansion was ruthlessly dismantling ancient traditions. And local populations? Well, they pushed back hard. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this pushback was relentless. Just trace the history with me for a second. We go from the Vellore Mutiny in 1806, which was sparked by deep resentments over military uniform changes that offended religious sensibilities, up through the Ahom Revolt in 1828, right after the British broke their promise to withdraw following the First Anglo-Burmese War. Then came the Kol Mutiny in 1831, leading right up to the massive Santhal Rebellion in 1855. This wasn't just a single isolated spark, it was a constant, overwhelming barrage across the entire subcontinent. The pressure was building steadily, year after bleeding year, as entirely alien systems of law and land ownership were forced onto populations that had governed themselves for centuries. Moving right along to part two, peasant and religious uprisings, basically fighting eviction and cultural intrusion. Now, imagine a landlord dispute so severe, so utterly desperate that it actually triggers an armed rebellion. Got that in your head? Okay, now imagine that happening 22 times in just 18 years. That is the sheer frequency of localized unrest we're talking about here. Driven to the absolute brink by greedy moneylenders and massive rent hikes that were pushing them to actual starvation, the Moplas of Malabar rose up 24 times between 1836 and 1854. Their fields were shrinking, revenue demands were skyrocketing, and the oppressive tactics of colonial officials left them with a terrible choice: starve quietly or fight back. And they chose to fight. Take the Kuka Movement, for example, founded in Punjab in 1840 by Bhagat Jawahar Mal. What started out as a strict religious purification campaign rapidly morphed into this fierce political drive to completely oust the British. And here is the mind-blowing part about this movement. They advocated for wearing only hand-woven clothes and actively boycotting English laws, education, and products. We are literally seeing the bedrock concepts of Swadeshi and non-cooperation bubbling up right here, nearly a full century before they became universally famous in the wider Indian nationalist movement. They were incredibly ahead of their time, wielding economic boycott as a weapon of war long before it was a mainstream political strategy. Which brings us to part three, the tribal revolts, the fight for land, forests, and autonomy.
To really get the tribal pushback, we have to look at the violent disruption of their ancient traditions. Mainland tribes relied heavily on shifting cultivation and joint land ownership, but colonial land settlements and strict new forest laws brutally tore that social fabric apart. So their revolts were largely agrarian. They were fighting against exploitative outsiders like merchants, moneylenders, and corrupt police who had invaded their ancestral homes. But the frontier tribes in the Northeast, they were a completely different beast. Sharing deep cultural links across the borders, they didn't just want agrarian reform or lower taxes. They demanded complete political autonomy and total independence from the British crown.
To truly grasp the intensity and sheer desperation of these clashes, picture this: 1,500 Shuar tribesmen taking up arms in May 1798. These weren't professional, highly trained soldiers. They were desperate farmers and hunters from the Raipur region, led by Durjan Singh. Faced with devastating famine, crushing revenue demands from an unyielding bureaucracy, and the horrifying prospect of their ancestral lands being publicly auctioned off to the highest foreign bidder, they reached a breaking point. They literally had no other choice but to fight to defend their very existence. Zooming out from those localized skirmishes, we start seeing massive, Messiah-led movements sweeping across the landscape. Think of Sidhu and Kanhu leading the Santals, Budo Bhagat leading the Kols, or the legendary Birsa Munda. These men weren't just seen as political organizers or military generals. They were viewed as charismatic, almost divine figures by their followers. Birsa Munda, for instance, was known as Dharti Abba, or Father of the Earth. They mobilized tens of thousands of people by promising something incredibly powerful, an absolute, spiritual, and physical end to the suffering brought by colonial laws. They provided hope where the British system provided only despair. All right, part 4, mutiny in the ranks, the alienated soldiers. Now, the Sepoys, the Indian soldiers actively serving in the British military, they shared the exact same civilian grievances as the peasants and tribesmen, for sure. But they also faced deeply personal, systemic offenses within the military hierarchy. They were deliberately pushed to the brink with severe discrimination in pay and promotions. To make matters worse, the government outright refused to pay them foreign service allowances when they were deployed to fight in remote, brutal regions. But the absolute breaking point? That was religious. The 1856 General Service Enlistment Act ordered recruits to be ready to serve outside India. For high-caste Hindu sepoys, crossing the ocean wasn't just a tough military deployment. It meant a terrifying absolute loss of their caste and their entire social standing in this life and the next. This leads us to our final section, Part 5, Why the Uprisings Failed, an Analytical Autopsy. So here is the million-dollar question. With all this passion, all these massive groups, why couldn't they successfully topple the empire? Well, honestly, because they were fatally fragmented. They fought at completely different times, in completely different regions, over highly localized grievances. The Moplaws fought for their fields, the Sepoys fought for their faith and pay, and the tribals fought for their forests, but they rarely fought together. More critically, their leadership was deeply backward-looking. They wanted to oust the alien rule, yes, but only to restore the old semi-feudal system of Rajas and Nawabs. They offered no alternative modern social setup for the future. There was no single unifying national impulse uniting them, only isolated pockets of common suffering. And the British? They capitalized on these structural weaknesses with ruthless clinical efficiency. First, they explicitly exploited that localized nature, keeping the revolts perfectly isolated from one another so a fire in the east wouldn't ignite the west. Second, they played brilliant political chess, pacifying the more cooperative or less obstinate leaders through clever concessions, promises of wealth, or restored land rights. And third, for those who simply wouldn't yield, they deployed superior modern military strategy, advanced logistics, outright deception and chicanery to crush them completely. It really all comes down to this one powerful historical summary. These rebellions were centuries old in form and ideological content. It was a tragic inevitability. No matter how incredibly brave the rebels were, no matter how fiercely they charged into battle, they were essentially bringing swords, bows, and centuries-old ideologies to fight a highly modern, incredibly organized and industrialized imperial machine. The playing field was completely uneven from the very start. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a powerful, lingering question. Were these localized failures actually just the necessary sparks for a united Indian nation? While doomed by outdated arms and fragmented timing, perhaps these continuous, fiery uprisings were the essential groundwork that proved resistance was possible. They were the crucial sparks that eventually ignited India's united fight for freedom in the centuries to follow. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the roots of early resistance. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.